All right, let's get this show on the road. So, hi everyone. I am, as mentioned, Hiski Huovila. I study game design here in Aalto. And let's see if the clicker works. No, it does not. Now it works. Yes, so I make games. I make art and I like technology. And when I'm not causing a headache for the different departments here in Aalto, I make video games with my team at Savukivi Games. We just released our first game, Finnish Cottage 8, just recently, and we are now working on figuring out what game to make next. But outside of those hours, I also make tabletop role-playing content. Here's a couple adventures and supplements that I've written for various games, and right now I'm working on my first big boy title called Runecycle. But today's topic, digital dungeon design. What do I mean by digital dungeon design? Well, I of course mean these games. You know the Legend of Zelda franchise, I hope, or the levels in the Skyrim franchise. There are obviously no other games in the Skyrim franchise, you know that, and games like Elden Ring, Dark Souls, medieval games that have a focus on knights and dungeons and enemies. But there are also other kinds of dungeons, such as in the Fallout franchise, or even adventure games or exploration games like Outer Wilds, where there are discrete environments that you explore, you delve into. Anything can be a dungeon if you so wish. Then what do I mean by tabletop tradition? Well, of course I mean tabletop role-playing games, so TTRPGs. A quick history lesson to maybe see where we came from. You might have heard of this game called Dungeons and Dragons, made by these two people in 1974. That got really, really popular, and they made a bunch of more of these games. Quite many, actually. We are currently in the 5.24th edition of D&D, which is the second version of the 5th edition of the Dungeons and Dragons franchise. But we're not here to talk about Dungeons and Dragons today. We're talking about these games, because there's a lot more to the dungeon crawling genre than Dungeons and Dragons, which coincidentally enough is no longer really that much about either Dungeons or Dragons. So there's a lot of other dungeon crawling games such as these, and there is a lot of them, like a lot of them. You can see some here in this wonderful graph, and when I say when I'm speaking of dungeon games, I'm speaking of this corner of the role-playing game field, which you can see is only a tiny corner of the whole field. And interestingly enough, D&D 5th edition 24 version is here, so it's not really in the field that we're speaking about today. Because today we are talking about the OSR, the old school Renaissance, Revival, Revolution. No one really knows, because the three defining characteristics of the OSR are: no one can agree what the OSR is, no one can agree what the R stands for, and the OSR is always over. So some people say that it started in the early 2000s. That much we can kind of agree on. Some people say it ended in 2019. That much we cannot agree on. But according to me, it is a movement, a philosophy, a community, a play style, a genre, and a label. And they like some parts of the old stuff. I hope that the people can agree that the old school part means the old stuff. So these editions of Dungeons and Dragons up to the revised second edition of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Because when the early 2000s, the third edition of Dungeons and Dragons came, released, and had a major shift in design, that led to people kind of taking their own inspirations from the editions that came before wanting to continue that tradition as opposed to continuing to what D&D was going to in the 3rd edition. So they invented the OSR. And there's one thing that the OSR is very much known for, which is that they love dungeons. Like, they really love dungeons. It's probably the most prolific RPG tradition in terms of adventures that you can buy that are mostly dungeons. And there's a whole market for just OSR-style dungeons, such as this one here. This was actually randomly generated with a random dungeon generator, because there is such a need for dungeons that we can't even write all of them. We have to also randomly generate them. And the question may be, why do they love these dungeons? Well, dungeons are kind of levels for these. Even though role-playing games are free-form, dungeons are very easy levels to make and play. They are enclosed, they're self-contained, and they are fun. So the OSR treats dungeons as problems to solve. And that makes them very good levels for both role-playing games as well as video games here. So we're going to take some ideas that have come up in the OSR community and apply them to the video game world to see if the design conventions and ideas would help us make better video game levels. So these are the main topics we're going to be talking here today, starting with the 5-Room Dungeons book by John Fore, which I kind of call the hero's journey for dungeons. And the 5-Room Dungeon consists of 5 rooms, which, cool fact, there are exactly 21 5-room dungeons. Here is all of them. We are finished now, you can go home. Conveniently, if you drop the last one, the 5 complete, where every room connects to every other room, which defeats the point of having rooms, there's 20 of them, which means you can roll a 20-sided die and randomize what shape your dungeon's going to be. Of course, you can move these little blobs around, change the shape, stretch them, but this is every possible shape that you can make with 5 rooms. Now let's go through the 5 rooms, starting with number 1, the entrance and guardian, where every dungeon needs an entrance, and the entrance and the guardian are there to explain why is the dungeon unexplored. There's some kind of creature or hidden door, or maybe it's just really hard to find the dungeon, to explain why is there loot and monsters that you can go find and kill, as opposed to just the local peasants just going there and looting it because it's free gold. Second, you would want to have a puzzle or role-playing challenge in your dungeon. It can be a literal block-pushing puzzle like in the Zelda games, or it can be more free-form. But the idea here is that dungeons are not just about killing things. After killing the guardian at the entrance, maybe, you want the player to do something other than fight. Room number 3, you want some kind of trick, a setback, a trap, a danger, something that kind of shakes the player and twists the dungeon, potentially even completely redefining what the dungeon is about. Either just a plot reveal or a literal trap that the player falls into. Number 4, climax, big battle, or conflict. You do want to end the dungeon in some kind of big, epic fight, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a fight. It can also be a chase sequence or a really difficult puzzle. However, after that or before it, you also want some kind of reward, revelation, and or plot twist. At the end of the dungeon, you don't want to just kill the boss and leave. You want to have some kind of cool finishing thing. You get the cool new item that you were looking for. There's maybe a big plot reveal, or you get some kind of narrative twist that tells you where to go next. Moving on to the Goblin Punch dungeon checklist, which I had to interpret a little to fit the video game world. We've stocked the dungeon with, you now have a 5-room dungeon. We have the bare bones of a dungeon, but that dungeon needs to be stocked by stuff to do. So number 1, put in something to steal. Loot, gold, money, XP, anything for the player to grab and take with them, because that's fun. That's what these games traditionally do, is you go there and you find stuff in the hidden corners of the dungeon. Number 2, there needs to be something to be killed. Because the player usually plays a game about combat, so if you have combat abilities, you do want to actually use them. So it's completely fine to put some fodder enemies in the dungeon to just be there to be killed, and they can then drop the something to steal. But not everything needs to be a big challenge. It's fun to also be able to just kill some enemies. However, then not everything should be easily killable. You should also have something to kill you, such as the moon, or a giant boulder, or a trap. Something that threatens the player and forces them to play differently. And preferably something that they cannot directly deal with by just killing it with their abilities. Number 4, very important, different paths. Linear dungeon is practically no dungeon at all. So you want to have branching pathways, doorways, different ways to move. Of course, the water temple in Ocarina of Time still has doors and locks and keys. So it's in many ways quite linear. But at least it gives you the impression of a giant space that you can move through. If you can make it a more sandboxy environment, that's better. Number 5, someone to talk to. It's good to have someone living in the dungeon, or at least present, some NPCs, or maybe a computer, a plot, some kind of plot devices, at least a sign that explains something about the world. Because not everyone that you encounter is an enemy, and this is a very good vehicle to deliver story and lore about the place. Maybe the dungeon's current denizens who you are here to kill have captured the previous people who lived here, and now you find them trapped, and you can talk to them and find out about what happened. Number 6, something to experiment with. Here's the hookshot, of course, one of the better tools to experiment with. But you want to give something for the player to play around with. A cool new ability, an item, maybe a funky physics object, anything that they can play around with and see what happens. And number 7, something the players probably won't find, because secrets are wonderful. You have to assume that it's a secret, so most players will not find it. That's why it's a secret. But for those players that really do want to clean the dungeon and go floor by floor and go through every nook and cranny to find all of the loot, all of the secrets, it's worth it to deliver those secrets to them, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to actually put a funny little Easter egg somewhere, or maybe have an extra collectible in your game that you can just hide into the places that you don't think players are going to go. And finally, from Prismatic Wisdom, the encounter checklist, which is based on the dungeon checklist, also interpreted by yours truly, because now we have a dungeon, and the dungeon has been stocked with all kinds of goodies. But we don't really know about the boss fight at all. What's the threat here? So, number 1, the encounter that happens in the dungeon. Now, encounter refers to the boss of the dungeon, or some kind of big encounter with an enemy or a threat. So it should happen to the player, because if the player is watching a cutscene where there's some other hero saving the dungeon from the boss fight, why are you there? Of course, that can have narrative potential, but generally speaking, you're there to play the game and explore the dungeon and fight the enemy, so fight the enemy. Number 2, tying you in with something to experiment with, make the encounter a toy. Not a teddy bear, though, because a soft teddy bear is not a threat, usually, unless you make it a threat. But all game designers know that what making something a toy means. But you want to make the fight something to play with. It's not just a series of actions you do. It needs to be fun to deal with the encounter. So when you're fighting, it allows for different kinds of fun things to do, such as dodging, blocking, combos, or cool abilities you can use, or varying terrain, anything that makes the encounter actually more than just you pressing buttons. Then tying into that, allow for multiple solutions, because that makes the players feel like they're clever. That if you have different types of magic arrows, bombs, the funky physics object I mentioned before, let that work. And make sure that there are more ways than just press X to kill the enemy. Because that's what makes players enjoy the encounter that much more. Number 4, you really need to think about what is the player motive. Why is the player here in this dungeon, and why are they fighting this boss fight? Because easily when you look at a Zelda game, especially an early one, you go into the dungeon, you get the magic item, and then you just assume that you're there to kill the boss. Because that's what you do. It's a video game. You kill the boss at the end of the game. But why are you doing this? Is it always just you have to kill it or you can't progress? Or does the player have some kind of motive? Does the enemy have something that the player needs or needs them to be killed? And flipping that on its head, what is the encounter motive? What does the boss want? What's the enemy want? Why does it want it? I mean, they're not there just to fight you for funsies. Of course, you can just put a creature living in the dungeon and they are protecting their home, but that's already a motive for them. So why does Ganondorf invade Hyrule? What's the point? Now, of course, you can't just say that they have a reason unless you can also show that they can actually accomplish what they want. So when there is a threat and an enemy that the player is supposed to deal with and the player has clashing motives with, you must actually prove that the enemy can actually accomplish what they want if the player doesn't stop them. And you should also know what the consequences are. Because if it's an optional boss fight, an optional dungeon, are there consequences of not dealing with it? In Majora's Mask, if you don't beat Majora, the moon crashes on the planet and everyone dies. That's a major consequence. And it's pretty great that they actually allowed you to see that consequence if you fail. Now, we have a great dungeon. We have a great dungeon. With all of that, you can build a pretty cool dungeon already. But I would also like to give a couple quick other tools that you can look into, because there's a plethora of resources. There's blogs, videos, talks. There's so much knowledge about this hidden all over the internet. So here's a couple pointers that you can look at. Starting with Jaquazing a dungeon, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is a type of non-linear level design philosophy by the late Janelle Jaquays. She unfortunately died, I believe, a year ago. She got her start and career in college in writing for role-playing games. Is famous for writing, for example, the Castle Greyhawk adventure. And later on, she actually moved on to video games and brought that level design knowledge from these acclaimed non-linear dungeons to, for example, the Quake franchise and Halo Wars. And there are in-depth articles on analyzing the level design of Janelle Jaquays, and I highly recommend looking into the ways that you can build a dungeon that's complex but still easy to manage, and also completely sandboxy, non-linear, with no keys and locks. But speaking of keys and locks, Cyclic Dungeon Generation by Joris Dormans, and later on interpreted by Serza Victory, was and is a level generation algorithm built for the game Unexplored, published by Ludomotion, which I believe it released in 2017, was acclaimed for its great dungeon design specifically. Serza Victory then converted those design principles and that framework into a tool, a booklet, if you will, for tabletop role-playing. So you can find the Cyclic Dungeon Generation zine on her itch, where she lays out different dungeon cycles that you can use, such as the lock and key cycle or the 2 keys cycle, to create varying levels of foreshadowing and dungeon flow. And finally, the 10-room dungeon by J.P. Cooper, because 5 rooms is not enough, and you can definitely add more. In his book, Flick Silverpen's Guide to Exploring Dungeons, he expands on the 5-room dungeon by John Four by adding a couple other pointers here. Starting from the top, you know the entrance to the Guardian already. You add a logical location, a place that makes sense to be in the dungeon. So this is a world-building tool where if the dungeon is a real lived place or used to be, you can add a room that's specifically just to show that the dungeon makes more sense to be an actual place. Environmental complication is exactly what it means. So there is something about the dungeon environment that's a problem. So it's not an enemy and it's not a trap. It's just the environment's dangerous. It's crumbling or it's in a volcano. Helpful information, pretty self-explanatory. One of the rooms provides you with information, maybe a secret, a weakness of the boss or something. This dungeon also kind of assumes that it's a non-linear dungeon that the player can explore in any way they want. So they are probably not exploring all of these rooms. So taking their time and going through all of them will get you all of these helpful tips. If you risk fighting the enemies, you can then find the helpful information. An alternate threat or an ally is a very interesting thought, that even though the dungeon is controlled by some hostile force, which is usually one force. There's the boss, and then the boss has minions. But what if there is a third faction also in the dungeon? The ally, of course, is the NPC mentioned before, but you can definitely also have like an alternative third-party enemy or an antagonist or some kind of third party who is not really antagonist to either of you, or maybe both you and the main enemy, so that you can maybe convince them to help you, or maybe you can fight them, either or. Secret entrance or exit, always fun. If the player needs to go into the dungeon through the outside, find a door, then hiding the door is of course fun, but it's sometimes a little dangerous to hide the obvious door if this is a very important dungeon that the player they have to find it or they can't complete the game. So then what you can do is you can add another secret entrance that gives them a slight advantage or a different point of view to the dungeon, maybe revealing something different or skipping entirely the entrance. The speedrunners are going to love it if you add a secret entrance that skips parts of the dungeon. And it's really fun to find those secret entrances. A resource drain is a room that just drains your resources. Its main purpose is to be something that you use what you have. So if you have limited mana, there's enemies that you need to cast spells on, or a puzzle that requires spellcasting. If you're thinking Zelda terms, maybe it's a room that requires you to use bombs or arrows, consuming your limited resources. So then you will have slightly less when you go to the final boss fight maybe, unless it's a game that gives all of the stuff that you need right before the boss fight so that you're fully stocked. But draining the player's resources kind of threatens them a little and makes them more conservative on their item use and makes them think, when should I use these items? Secret we've already covered. Add a secret. Everyone loves secrets. And the last two, by big battle, final conflict, and reward, revelation, or plot twist are obviously the big boss and the reward that you get. And that's it. That are the tools for today. Do remember that Dungeons & Dragons was written more than 10 years before the first Legend of Zelda came out. So there is already 10 years of dungeons that have been explored before the first digital Zelda game was made. So go read those blogs, watch those videos, look at those resources. There are so many online, and they're all hidden in these wonderful little websites from the early 2000s. Thank you.
Mic test. It's working. Perfect. Thank you, Hiski. Sorry for waiting for the mic to come. We have plenty of time for discussion for
Yes.
this. So if audience has any OSR or dungeon questions, please help me with that, I guess. But I'm gonna have to ask first, why dungeons? What's with the dungeons?
Well,
Why not?
yeah, why not is the first question, of course. For me personally, it's funny, I'm not that into dungeons. Specifically, I really don't like medieval dungeons. Traditional, below the castle, cold, damp prisoners, whatever. I don't like that. But the thing is, a dungeon can be anything.
Yep.
A dungeon is an enclosed space, and it doesn't even technically have to be enclosed, more than it just has to be a defined space. So a dungeon can be a forest with clearings and pathways between the trees. As long as you can't walk through the trees, that makes it a dungeon in my book.
So it's sort of like a magic circle within a magic circle, so to speak.
Yes. It's a framework of thinking.
Yeah. So help me out a little bit. So I don't play any TTRPGs, but OSR, the R not being agreed upon. But is it only like an analog world, or is that actually also digital games realm?
Right. Well, generally, it's only analog. That's what it started as, and that's what the people would probably call it as, especially when some people say that it's already over, so we can't exactly say. However, if we consider the 2025 games also part of the OSR movement, some would argue that's now the NSR movement, the New School Revolution or Revival or Renaissance. There is actually a video game being developed based on the hit game Merkborg, which is by many definitions an OSR game. So soon we will have the OSR video games, but right now no one's really calling video games OSR games, although for many roguelikes, especially very traditional dungeon crawling roguelikes, you could argue that they are OSR games in many ways.
I would always say that you can make an old school any time in the world, and we are doing that. We see that, for instance, in the developing games to obsolete technology or consoles, and so sort of like celebrating the aesthetics of the old times. So why not also like original dungeons or whatnots there? For digital game making, you've done that quite a lot as well. So what do you think are the kind of strongest points that you learned from making also TTRPGs or looking at OSR? What do you transfer personally most from between these realms?
Right.
Let's talk about, for instance, the cottage game.
Right. Well, for the cottage game, I guess you could consider cottage a dungeon. We didn't really use dungeon design principles for the cottage game. But for our next project, we're definitely thinking about how can we build something on top of the very cool tabletop things. And to me, of course, Disco Elysium, computer RPGs, Baldur's Gate. Those are very specifically role-playing game inspired, and the whole CRPG, computer RPG genre came to be to emulate the tabletop role-playing game feel, because people wanted to play role-playing games, but they didn't have access to other people to play with, because the one flaw about Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games is that you need a group of people to play them with and a lot of time to play it. Of course, solo RPGs are also a growing trend, so that's a completely different beast. But computer RPGs definitely are currently the way to take inspiration from the tabletop, and they usually do that by adding dice or stats. They kind of mimic the feel of the tabletop game. But a lot of computer RPGs, to me, kind of miss the point that the dice are not the point. Of course, you do want to roll dice, but dice rolling doesn't make something an RPG. Random probability doesn't make something an RPG. What makes something an RPG is the freedom to choose. The freedom to explore the world as the character you want to be. And even if you have a very discrete character like Disco Elysium, you have Henry Dubois, I believe is his name, you still have the freedom to choose, and Disco Elysium specifically is very good at branching the narrative based on your choices and stats and rolls. So to me, that's what the video game world should try to emulate from the RPG world, is the freedom. Of course, with AI and stuff, people might try something like procedurally generated or AI generated worlds. But I don't really see that as the point, that you don't need to be able to do everything as long as you have freedom to do a lot of things and express yourself.
So open world games would be sort of in that line of thinking.
Potentially, especially with the OSR philosophy, which is specifically about sandbox design, that you're not going to give a solution, you're just going to give a problem. So then if you look at like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which is very OSR-y in the machine design and the way you explore dungeons and encounter the world, you could argue that those are OSR principles being used in video game design.
Yeah. Okay. So you were listing of the kind of the design principles for making this game experience, and I pointed out from something to experiment with. What would be your favorite existing experiment with thingy in the games that you've played or made?
In the games that I played, first of all, I want to bring back the Tears of the Kingdom, because the Tears of the Kingdom physics engine is fantastic. I haven't actually played that game, but the way that you can build these funny little devices and use the physics engine to both explore, solve, and break the existing dungeons, that's really what I'm talking about with something to play with. But from games that I've played, I wonder...
Because I found it a bit like, that's really hard to design, right?
It is very hard. But Zelda games are a very good example of this. That in traditional Zelda design, which I guess Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom kind of reinvented the whole genre now, but let's say traditional Zelda, like the ones that I showed, Ocarina of Time and the 2D Zeldas. You go into a dungeon, you get a new item. You fight the boss with the item, because the boss is weak to the item. It's a bit boring maybe, it's a bit obvious, but at the same time, when you get that item the first time, the hook shot especially, or the claw shot, that gives you so much freedom, because the claw shot you can of course use to traverse, you can claw shot into targets that you can pull yourself to, but you can also claw shot enemies that deals damage to them, so that's a completely new way to kill enemies at range. In some games, I believe you get 2 of them, which makes you a full Spider-Man. You can just go everywhere, wherever there are hookshot targets and grades you can claw onto. That's Twilight Princess, I believe. So overall, you don't really need to give like a fully free-form toy here. You can just give a magic item, a tool that has at least a couple different uses to at least traverse and maybe fight. And that's already something that you can like kind of start experimenting with, finding combos, and finding what ways you should be using it. Fun fact, the fishing rod is one of the only weapons, I believe, that you can fight Ganondorf with in one of the Zelda games. For no reason, Ganondorf is weak to the fishing rod, but he is. And I believe that's kind of an exploration of that, something to experiment with.
How do you hand the experiment with thing in a tabletop role-playing setup?
Well, tabletop role-playing games are easy in the way that there's a human running the game world. There's a game master, dungeon master, referee, depending on... OSR usually calls it the referee, because it's very rulings-based, as opposed to kind of like storytelling-based. So you really just need to give the players something weird. And that's why the dungeon writing community is so big in the OSR, because everyone's always hungry for new weird things. So you can give a cursed magic item that speaks to the player only in riddles, but maybe also, I don't know, converts cold into iron. I don't know what use that would have, but that's not your problem, that's the player's problem. Because the players are humans, and humans are creative. So what they can do is create completely insane contraptions, MacGyver the stuff in the dungeon. Because the sword that can turn gold into iron may be the way that you open the golden door, and then you turn parts of it into, I guess iron's stronger than gold, but if it turned iron into gold, that would actually make the iron door weaker, so then you can kick through the door, which is not the way you were supposed to open the door.
Yeah.
But in these games, don't give a key, because you can expect the party thief to just pick the lock anyway.
Yeah. So you're gonna be there to review whether, you know, what happens with their creative choices and sort of like wing into it. We have an interesting sort of history of mixing tabletop role-playing games with radio. Have you been listening to any of the captures of the Lohikäärmepuu?
I don't think I have. I believe that was before I was old enough to read. But
That was 1990.
yes, that was older. Oh, that's older than me then.
Exactly.
But it's really interesting that we have or had this type of remote dungeon exploration. I don't know if they had really done. I guess they had dungeons in that, but
At least, I think that the way that they made it is that they made the maps. So I do think that is much of the dungeon design in that sense.
yeah, I guess if you have a map, it already makes the dungeon even if it wasn't inside anywhere. Just an overland map could also be a dungeon. So I guess that is one of the solutions to the I don't have time to play or people to play with problem.
Exactly.
We've been creative for a long time here.
Yeah. So let's, even though the original D&Ds are part of the OSR, if I understood anything from this talk, no?
It's
Some of it.
complicated. Mainly, I would say the original D&Ds, they are old school.
Yeah.
OSR is what came after.
Right.
They wanted to play those games still,
Yeah.
but the new version of D&D wasn't what they wanted.
Wasn't good enough.
Yes, I believe the license also switched companies, so they changed design direction and invented a completely new genre of game.
So it's like rogue is not roguelike. Rogue is rogue.
Kind of, yes. But there are games, especially the early OSR games, that are direct clones of the old D&D games, because the third edition of D&D came with a permissible license that you could use the IP, or not the IP, but the text in the book to make your own games. And that was really cool. That basically created the whole OSR thing because you could legally do that now. So then people essentially rewrote the old D&D books again, cleaned it up a bit and fixed some things, but mostly kept it the same. And that's what kind of kickstarted the OSR. But then because of the DIY nature of the whole thing, it just kept going, and people kept making more and more changes and new fixes and different games from these same original ideas following the same design principles.
So, I mean, like, I have never played a TTRPG game, or, well, if the Lohikärmepuu is not counted, I don't think it is.
Well, it plays similarly enough.
So, but what is your take on sort of explaining D&D's rising popularity? We've seen it Stranger Things from 2016 onwards. It's been a while already now, but we can see it everywhere. Like, there's a lot of things around that community. What's with the sort of like a longer term hype now? What has happened?
It's a combination of things. Many things went right in the late 2010s, I believe, because I believe 2014, the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons came to be. They released it after the mostly disliked 4th edition of D&D. It had its fan, of course, but it was kind of losing ground. D&D wasn't really, 4th edition wasn't really cool. It was losing ground to World of Warcraft and also
which was already old.
other role-playing games of that time. Because at that time also like storytelling games and more or less dungeony games were in. Then they released the 5th edition, where their design goal was to combine all of the different ideas from all of the different versions of D&D. So in a funny way, the 5th edition brought more of the old school to the new. So they took a lot of the old school ideas, kind of made their own OSR D&D in a way when they made the 5th edition. Someone will really hate me for that comment, but that's on them. They made the simplest version of D&D yet. They took the simplicity of the old games and combined it with the popular character building of the new. So they made the easiest version of D&D to play to that date.
Access.
Then stranger things happened.
Yeah.
That kind of brought D&D to mainstream in the sense that people remembered that, hey, I used to do that. That was fun.
That exists.
What's going on now with D&D?
Yeah.
That also all coincided with kind of the growth of nerd culture. That Marvel MCU was becoming a big deal at that point. And overall, being nerdy and liking games and fantasy was now suddenly cool again. Or I guess it was never cool, but
Exactly.
it was becoming mainstream, accepted in a way. So then when Stranger Things happened, D&D became the most accessible it has been, combined with Twitch becoming a thing and people starting to live stream. So shows like Critical Role,
Yep.
which was maybe, it wasn't the first one. There was a couple other D&D shows before that, but they weren't bigly popular. But when 7 of the like world's most popular, well-known voice actors decided to play D&D on the internet, you can imagine that their performance suddenly became an incredible piece of theater, improv theater. It's hard to even say if they played D&D at that point because they're so good at acting.
Yeah.
But that really showed people,
What
and
you can do.
especially
Yeah.
the non-gamers, what D&D can be. And we've just been growing ever since.
I have a final question. So we have a game jam running at the moment. We haven't seen, I don't remember if I've seen any game jams with the tabletop role-playing games. Especially, I wouldn't be able to detect whether they're OSR or not. What are your tips if someone wants to make a TTRPG? What are the tools and resources to go to?
Assuming that you're a first-timer, which you probably are, because if you aren't, then you would probably already know where to go.
Exactly, yeah.
The easiest way is to pick an existing game, because the role-playing scene, tabletop role-playing scene, is very open to sharing stuff. So stealing a design from someone is considered a great honor if you credit them, and these books usually come with a long list of inspirations, both from media as well as books, and that's something I would love to have in the video game world. Imagine at the end of GTA 6 they show every single movie that they watched during development. That'd be crazy, but it would be really cool to give credit to the originals. So pick a game, read that game, figure out how it works, and then start making your own tweaks on it. The OSR is wonderful in the sense that it's a really DIY-driven community. So many of the OSR games, such as Knave or Cairn or Into the Odd, I guess Into the Odd doesn't count here, are actually openly licensed, Creative Commons licensed. So you can just take the game and make changes to it, and it's legally yours.
And you release it with the same.
But even if you don't,
license,
even if you can't use the text word to word, if it's not licensed publicly openly, many of the OSR authors would be honored if you'd build a game on it, and they actually have these like little signs you can do. Into the Odd has Mark of the Odd. Apocalypse World is not OSR, but it's a different game that has the Powered by the Apocalypse label. Pretty much every big game has its own label that you can attach to your game, saying it was based on this other game.
Yeah.
Because then that acts as a marketing tool for people who liked that game, that they know that this game plays kind of the same, so it's easy for them to jump into it. And then you can use that to promote it as well.
Are you going to make one this week?
Definitely, but not part of the game jam. But I am already making 3 role-playing games as is.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely making one, but it's not going to finish this week.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Hiski, so much for this talk and all the insights for the things that I would not know otherwise. And thank you so much.
Thank you.